And protesters are crippling rail lines. In Toronto, they obstructed a major intersection, disrupting travel for 24,000 people.
Despite repeated warnings from police.
Since the beginning of 2020, protesters have taken to the streets across Canada. According to them, they're in support of the Indigenous peoples of northern BC. But does this anti-pipeline narrative truly reflect the views of actual Indigenous leaders in British Columbia? I set out to answer that question. I went to northern BC with a film crew to find out exactly what Indigenous Canadians have to say about pipeline projects in their communities. I wanted to know, do the Indigenous people of BC actually oppose pipelines? Or is this media-driven narrative simply a well-orchestrated distraction? Let's find out the truth. My name is Aaron Gunn, and this is Politics Explained.
We can also offload on the fly, right? So it's like...
This is the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. One of two multi-billion-dollar pipeline projects under construction right now in British Columbia. The other, Coastal GasLink, will transport natural gas from Dawson Creek in northeastern BC to the coastal city of Kitimat, where it will be liquefied in LNG Canada's $40 billion export facility and shipped overseas. This is the pipeline people have been protesting. Across the province and the entire country, protesters have taken to the streets, erecting illegal blockades and demanding the pipeline be stopped, arguing it infringes on the fundamental rights of First Nation peoples and is being undemocratically imposed upon them. But this anti-pipeline narrative ignores one very inconvenient fact. All 20 elected First Nation bands along the pipeline route have signed agreements with Coastal GasLink in support of the project. Every single one. The result of an intensive, decade-long consultation process between Coastal GasLink and Indigenous leadership. I met with one of those leaders, the former Chief Councillor of the Haisla First Nation and current MLA for Skeena, BC, Ellis Ross.
I've been listening to the problems of First Nations for too long, and I was fed up. So I thought, I'm gonna basically set down a framework of how we actually address our own issues on our own terms. And I'm just glad it worked out the way it did, because now we're not looking back. We are a completely different community from 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Completely different.
In 2006, when Ellis was the elected chief of the Haisla, he signed an agreement with Kitimat LNG worth $50 million. Since then, Kitimat has become an economic powerhouse in the region. But it hasn't always been easy for Indigenous bands like the Haisla. This is Joe Skin, a former elected band councillor for the Skintai Nation and father of four.
I grew up across south of Francis Lake. There wasn't much opportunity for First Nations back then. My dad had employment on and off, and most of the time we got anything new, I had to go to the dump pile with my dad to scrounge around for odds and ends that people threw away, you know. So it was a lifestyle that was difficult like that, and made me into a stronger person growing up. But I never gave up.
This desperate situation is not uncommon. According to the Canadian Poverty Institute, 1 in 4 Indigenous people in Canada live below the poverty line, including 40% of all Indigenous children. Even more distressing, the suicide rate for Aboriginal youth is 7 times higher than the Canadian average. the result of continued challenges with addiction in many communities, coupled with a chronic shortage of economic opportunity. But things are starting to change. Some Indigenous leaders have found ways to lift their people out of this devastating cycle. In December of 2014, when Joe was an elected councillor, his band signed an agreement with the provincial government and Coastal GasLink, a deal which gave the go-ahead for the pipeline through Skin Tyee territory, while also securing millions of dollars in annual revenue and job guarantees for the Skin Tyee people.
The discussions lasted about 3 to 3.5 years with CGL before the benefits agreements were signed. And we had lots of questions, lots of concerns. They answered it for us, and they made sure that we were feeling comfortable as possible, and we appreciated that. They treated us very respectfully and professionally.
Each of the other 19 bands made similar agreements as well, tailored uniquely to their communities and the needs of their people. Millions and millions of dollars each year are now being distributed directly to First Nations along the pipeline route. But what I was starting to understand was what this project brings is more than just annual revenue. I met with the current chief counselor of the Haisla First Nation, Crystal Smith, to discuss the deep and profound effects Coastal GasLink and economic development has had on her community.
In terms of the impact on our people, the employment opportunities, the focus for us is not just the short-term jobs, but the long-term careers that are going to be established from this. I grew up thinking that either I'm going to work in the band office or become a teacher. And generally, I mean, you've got the band office and you've got the school in your community. So the difference from my generation to what we've been able to establish today, I've got two young daughters, I've got a grandson, and the opportunities are endless for them.
And Crystal isn't alone in feeling this way.
Has the jobs and economic development, those opportunities, does that help alleviate a bunch of those other problems that you mentioned about? There's a correlation there?
Big time.
Would you, for people in your community, has Coastal GasLink created a bunch of opportunities for employment and stable families and stuff that didn't exist before?
Yep, yeah, that's for sure. There's a lot of opportunities that our band members benefit from CGL right now. We have quite a few members that are working on the pipeline.
We keep putting band-aids on Aboriginal issues. We keep putting band-aids on it, whereas I saw when this young guy got a job, he was making a lot of money, he was saving a lot of money, and then he said, well, I want to buy a truck, I want to go on holiday. Well, that's a value. And the success is actually amazing, is what we're seeing right now.
It is, and I wonder why we don't hear that message more often in the media. It's always, you pointed out the kind of the Band-Aid solutions. Yeah. It seems like those are the ones that are always being proposed by the panels or the different groups that come out with reports.
And I've said this before, but it was never publicized because it's actually too controversial to say it, because this is a living for these leaders to live off the misery of natives in Canada. It's a huge industry. The Indian Act alone is billions and billions of dollars. So why would anybody want to fix it? And this is what drives me crazy, because when I go back to my own community and I see some of these kids suffering, and I see some of our own people suffering, and then I hear some windbag politician talk about another program that's not even going to help, that gets me angry.
The reason why all 20 of these bands voted to support the pipeline was becoming clearer to me. The impact of billion-dollar development projects like this on First Nation communities can be not just meaningful, but truly transformative. Economically, yes, but socially and culturally as well. So how could anyone make the argument that these projects are somehow stripping Indigenous people of their own sovereignty? Well, it's simple. These radical groups view elected leaders like Ellis Ross as illegitimate, since the entire system of Indigenous bands, band councils, elected leaders, and chiefs was established by the Indian Act in 1876. I made this argument to a former elected councillor for the Lekwilum Band, Chris Sankey.
elected councillors and chiefs are illegitimate because they're tools of the Indian Act and colonialism.
Before they make comments like that, they need to actually understand just what the responsibilities of the government, the elected body for that community is. You're literally overseeing everything for everybody, right down from the kitchen sink to negotiate a multi-billion-dollar impact benefits agreement.
How does it make you feel when you hear certain groups or individuals that call elected band councils illegitimate, creations of the federal government, colonial instruments, all these different kind of derogatory terms get applied to them? How does that make you feel?
I'm very disrespected, for sure.
The truth is, these leaders were elected and put in these positions of power by their people to make decisions on their behalf. They are doing so to make a difference in the lives of their community members.
The reason why I wanted to try to run for band council was because seeing my band go through the ringer from shady band councillors in the past, you know, I wanted to make an example of what a good leader would do for his community. That's one of the main reasons why I ran for band council.
And in many cases, it's these bands and these leaders who are leading the charge for resource development in their communities.
We're not being oppressed. In fact, in terms of the LNG opportunity, it was actually my band that brought the LNG opportunity to the BC legislature. It wasn't the other way around.
But the problem is that you have a small group of activists going all over the countryside trying to make it look like everybody that is Indigenous is against development, and that is simply not true. Indigenous people are for responsible resource development, period.
Over the course of this trip, I met with a lot of proud Indigenous Canadians, and something I was hearing over and over again was about the importance of jobs and new opportunities.
Back then, there was no real opportunities for our people. There wasn't very many jobs, especially for women in our day.
And our mill here is shut down too. So that's a lot of jobs. And you know, government can help out so much, but we need to work like everybody else. We want to work.
Don't take what you see in the media, don't take word, you know, at face value. Find out what the people of the community wants. People want to work.
So, do all First Nations in BC actually oppose pipelines? Well, no. In fact, when you go to these communities and talk with real people, the vast majority of First Nations actually want projects like the Coastal GasLink pipeline. They want development. They want real change. So, where do we go from here? What does the future have in store?
Well, that's probably easier to talk about what's next for the Haisla than it is for myself. For the Haisla, sky's the limit.
My name is Aaron Gunn, and this has been Politics Explained.